We live on solid ground. At least that's what we tell ourselves. But what happens when the ground decides otherwise? When entire cities vanish in minutes, and silence follows? This isn't fiction. These are real stories, from ancient tragedies to modern disasters, from forgotten victims to global catastrophes. This is the true haunting history of earthquakes, and no matter where you live, one truth remains: we are all just one tremor away from everything changing. Welcome to True Crime Echoes. Chapter 1, It Started with a Rumble. Do you remember earthquake drills? I do. I grew up in California, and honestly, they were just part of life, like fire alarms or recess, or those weird square pizzas they served in the cafeteria. Earthquake drills didn't feel scary back then. They felt routine, normal even. We'd duck under desks, hold the legs, stay quiet. Teachers made it seem like if we followed the rules, we'd be safe. But the thing is, no one ever tells you how different it feels when it's real. When the ground actually starts shaking beneath you without warning, your brain doesn't immediately go, "Ah, yes, time for the procedure." It goes blank. At least mine does. The last time it happened, I froze. My mind scrambled. Am I supposed to go to a doorway? Crawl under the table, is that even what you do anymore? Or am I confusing it with stop, drop, and roll? I think I rolled. I'm not even kidding. I dropped to the floor and rolled, and it did absolutely nothing. It's strange, isn't it? We train for danger, we prepare for it, but when it finally arrives, instinct doesn't always save us. Sometimes it betrays us. And that's the thing about earthquakes. They're not like storms, you don't see them coming. There's no countdown, no warning sirens, no time to pack a bag. 1 second, you're pouring coffee, scrolling your phone, laughing at a meme, and the next, your entire world is shifting. Literally. But here's what I didn't understand until I started researching this story: an earthquake isn't always the end. Sometimes it's just the beginning. There are earthquakes so massive, so devastating that they've changed the very rotation of the earth. Others have reshaped coastlines, swallowed cities, and triggered tsunamis that travel thousands of miles. And in some corners of the world far from the fault lines we hear about on the news, earthquakes have sparked panic, so deep people turned to ancient beliefs. They lit fires, they prayed, and sometimes they made sacrifices. Human ones. I wasn't ready for that part. This story isn't just about earthquakes. It's about what happens after, when the dust hasn't settled, when people are still counting their dead, and when desperation becomes something else entirely. It's about how disasters don't just break buildings, they crack belief systems. They shake us loose from logic, and they reveal something darker. So today, we're going to talk about the history of earthquakes, but not the way they taught us in science class. We're going to look at the tragedies, the terror, and the very human need to make sense of the unexplainable. Because sometimes it's not just the earth that fractures, it's us. Let's begin. Chapter 2. When the earth decides to move. Before we dive into the tragedies, into the stories of people and places swallowed by the earth, I think we need to talk about what an earthquake actually is. Not in a scientific, boring, diagram-filled way, but in a way that makes sense, emotionally. Because earthquakes are personal. They mess with something most of us take for granted every second of every day: the ground beneath us. The one thing we expect to be solid, unshakable, safe. Turns out that's all an illusion. The surface of the earth, what we walk on, build homes on, raise our families on, isn't one solid sheet. It's actually made up of massive puzzle pieces called tectonic plates. And these plates are constantly moving. They drift, they bump into each other, they slide under and over one another like slow-motion giants. Most of the time, we don't even notice. But when they get stuck, that's when it gets dangerous. See, the plates don't glide smoothly. There's friction. And when two plates lock together, all that pressure just builds and builds, until eventually something has to give. And when it does, that's the earthquake. A sudden, violent release of energy, like the earth letting out a scream that's been building for years. That's why when an earthquake hits, it doesn't feel like chaos. It is chaos. It's raw, primal. It reminds you instantly that nature isn't tame. It never was. We just got comfortable pretending it was. Now, when it comes to measuring earthquakes, we usually hear numbers tossed around: magnitude 5, 6.8, or the big one everyone's waiting for in California, supposedly above an 8. But what do those numbers really mean? Well, back in 1935, a man named Charles Richter came up with a scale to measure earthquake strength. You've probably heard of it, the Richter scale. It's basically a way to measure how much energy is released during a quake. And the wild part? It's exponential. That means a magnitude 6 isn't just a little stronger than a 5, it's 10 times stronger. A 7, 100 times more powerful than a 5. It adds up quickly. And when you're in the middle of it, trust me, you don't need a number to know it's bad. You feel it in your bones. What fascinates me, though, is how helpless we still are. Even with all our technology, even with satellites, apps, AI models, and sensors buried deep underground, we still can't predict earthquakes. Not accurately. Not with enough time to do anything that really matters. At best, you might get a notification seconds after it hits. That's not a warning. That's a confirmation of what your body already knows. So most of the time, you're just on your own. There's no countdown. No voice saying, "Get to safety now." Just this sudden, visceral shift in reality. And what's worse, it doesn't stop there. See, an earthquake is often just the first domino to fall. Because when the earth moves, it doesn't just shake the ground. It can trigger landslides, fires, floods, tsunamis. Entire cities have been wiped out not by the quake itself, but by what came after. And maybe that's what makes them so terrifying. Not just the unpredictability, but the way they open the door to a chain of disasters you can't control or contain. They don't just knock buildings down. They knock us off balance physically, emotionally, spiritually. It's no surprise, really, that in ancient times, and honestly, even in modern times, people saw earthquakes as signs from the gods. Punishments, warnings. There's something biblical about them, something mythic. They make us feel small, and sometimes they make us desperate. In the stories we're about to explore, that desperation will turn into something else, something darker. We'll see people try to explain the unexplainable, to take back control in the only way they think they can, and the results are devastating. Let's move forward. Chapter 3, A Night the Earth Refused to Sleep. The thing about history is, we tend to forget how fragile people were. No warning systems, no Richter scale, no earthquake-resistant buildings, just people, families, sleeping in silence, completely unaware that the earth beneath them was about to shift and take almost everything with it. That's exactly what happened in the year 1556 in the Shanxi province of China. I'll be honest with you, I hadn't even heard of this earthquake until I started researching this story, and that alone shocked me. Because this wasn't just any earthquake. It was, and still is, the deadliest earthquake in recorded human history. Over 830,000 lives lost. Let that number sit with you for a second. That's more than some cities. Gone. In a single moment. Back then, China was in what many considered a golden age. The Ming dynasty was thriving, the economy was strong, the empire was expanding, and people were for the most part doing well. Life was structured orderly and deeply rooted in tradition. But beneath that surface, literally pressure had been building for centuries. In the region of Shanxi, many people lived in what were called yaodong, or house caves. These were homes carved directly into the sides of cliffs and hillsides, practical for the time. They stayed cool in the summer, warm in the winter. They blended into the landscape. And for generations, they seemed safe, until they weren't. On the night of January 23rd, 1556, while most people were fast asleep, the ground began to groan. Witnesses later described it as the loudest sound they'd ever heard, like thunder ripping through the earth itself. And then came the shaking. The earthquake lasted only a few seconds. Just a few. But that was enough. The Yaodong homes carved into soft, loess soil weren't built to withstand that kind of movement. The cliffs crumbled. The homes collapsed inward. Entire families were buried alive as the hills folded in on themselves. And that was just the beginning. The quake triggered massive landslides, wiping out villages in seconds. Entire mountains shifted, sending tons of earth and rock tumbling into rivers. Water was rerouted, redirected, and rushed into towns, flooding entire communities that were already buried in mud. For the villages that somehow managed to escape the flooding or the landslides, fires broke out. Remember, this was the 1500s. No electricity. Fire was used for light heat cooking. And when buildings collapsed with open flames still burning inside, the result was catastrophic. Temples, schools, government buildings all fell. Even parts of the royal family weren't spared. One account says over 100 government officials were killed instantly when their quarters crumbled. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? No science to explain what was happening. No news, no social media, no emergency services. Just chaos. People crying out in the dark, clawing through dirt trying to find their loved ones, trying to survive, and not understanding why this was happening. In the absence of science, superstition filled the gap. Many believed this was divine punishment, that the gods were angry. Some thought it was the end of the world. And honestly, I don't blame them. When the earth moves beneath your feet and the sky is filled with smoke and screams, what else are you supposed to believe? The death toll was staggering. More than 60% of the population in the affected region was wiped out, and even the survivors weren't really safe. Aftershocks continued for months. Some reports even say they went on into the following year. People were afraid to go back into their homes if they had any left at all. Many slept outside, terrified the ground would open again beneath them. Now, because this happened in the 1500s, there was no official magnitude assigned at the time. But modern seismologists have studied the geology of the region and estimated that this earthquake likely reached between 8.0 and 8.3 on the modern scale. But the magnitude doesn't even begin to describe the human cost. This was one of those disasters that didn't just kill people, it reshaped everything. It changed where people lived, how they built homes, what they believed in, and how they saw the world. For those who survived, life would never go back to the way it was. And for the rest, they vanished in the dirt. Entire family trees wiped from the future in seconds. And yet most people today have never even heard of it. That's what strikes me most. This wasn't just a statistic in a textbook. It was real. Entire cities silenced overnight. A disaster so massive that even the emperor had to publicly mourn the loss, and yet here we are nearly 500 years later barely remembering it happened at all. That's why I wanted to tell this story. Because when we talk about natural disasters, we focus on the damage, the numbers, the logistics. But behind every collapsed wall and shattered building were people. Real people, with names, with dreams, with families they were trying to protect. And in this case, they never even saw it coming. This was just one of many earthquakes history has buried beneath its own rubble. But it won't be the last. And as we'll see, sometimes what comes after the shaking can be even worse. Let's keep going. Chapter 4. The day the ocean came home. Sometimes the earth doesn't just shift, it snaps. And on May 22nd, 1960, off the coast of southern Chile, it did exactly that. To this day, it remains the most powerful earthquake ever recorded, a magnitude 9.5. That's not just a big earthquake, that's the kind of energy that moves continents. Literally, and I don't say that for drama, it's geological fact. I want you to imagine standing outside, maybe talking to a neighbor, walking your dog, or reading a book in the afternoon sun. Then suddenly, the world around you doesn't just tremble, it roars. The pavement beneath your feet starts to roll like waves. Buildings sway like trees in a storm. And it doesn't stop. Not for 30 seconds. Not for a minute. Not even for 2. It goes on for 10 minutes. 10 minutes of the ground beneath you no longer being trustworthy. 10 minutes of chaos, screaming, collapsing, running, falling. Of wondering if this is it, if the earth is finally done with you. That's what the people of Chile lived through that day. The epicenter was near the town of Valdivia, but the shaking was felt for over 1,000 miles. And what's terrifying is that the earthquake itself, this record-breaking, monstrous quake, was only the beginning. 15 minutes after the shaking stopped, the ocean started to behave strangely. The water along the coast pulled back. It didn't just recede a little, it emptied out like a tide in fast forward. And to those who knew what it meant, that was the real warning sign, because when the ocean pulls away, it's coming back with force. The tsunami hit Chile's coastline with waves that reached up to 82 feet high in some areas. That's the size of a 7-story building made of water traveling at terrifying speeds and with nowhere to go but forward. Entire coastal towns were swallowed. Ships were lifted out of harbors and smashed into rooftops. Cars floated like toys. People clung to trees' debris, anything they could get their hands on. Others never even had the chance to run. But the destruction didn't stop in Chile. That tsunami triggered by that single earthquake didn't just stay local. It crossed the entire Pacific Ocean. Think about that. A wave born in South America traveling 7,000 miles across the sea and hitting Hawaii hours later with 35-foot waves. 61 people died there, and it kept going. Japan, 10,000 miles from the epicenter, was hit next. Entire neighborhoods destroyed, over 130 people killed. The Philippines, massive waves again, dozens more lives lost, and all of this from an earthquake that lasted 10 minutes. In total, the death toll from the 1960 Chile earthquake and its resulting tsunami is estimated at over 1,600 people, with thousands injured and millions displaced. Entire communities were wiped off the map. And even those who survived didn't really feel lucky. They felt broken, homeless, lost. Everything familiar was gone. And here's the thing that always gets me. You don't just rebuild after something like that. You relearn how to live. The psychological impact of a disaster this large isn't talked about nearly enough. The constant fear that it might happen again, that it will happen again, that every rumble, every creak in the floorboards might be the start of another 10-minute nightmare. And it's not just fear, it's grief. Grief for your home, grief for your neighbors, grief for the version of life that existed before the earth decided to take it back. One story that stayed with me is from a survivor named Carmen. She described how during the quake, the streets in her town started to move like ocean waves. She couldn't even stand up. She said it felt like the world had become liquid and that time just stopped. That kind of trauma doesn't fade. What's even more haunting is what came after the quake and the tsunami. The aftermath. Flooded lakes spilled into towns. Rivers changed course. Diseases spread. Crops failed. And in some rural communities, people didn't look to science for answers. They looked to something more ancient, more spiritual. They believed the gods were angry. In one remote Mapuche village, this belief became deadly. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next chapter. But before we get there, I want to pause for a moment, not for drama, but for perspective. This wasn't some medieval story we're dusting off from the 1500s. This was 1960. My parents were alive. Maybe your grandparents were. Color television existed. The Beatles were about to take over the world. This was modern. And yet, when the Earth decided to move, no amount of progress or technology could stop it. Not then, and not now. What this earthquake revealed, just like the one in Shanxi centuries earlier, is that no matter how advanced we think we are, we're all still standing on borrowed time, on borrowed ground. And when it shifts, everything else follows, including us. In the next chapter, we'll explore what desperation can do to people who are already grieving, already afraid. How tragedy, fear, and belief can collide and result in something even darker than nature itself. I'll warn you now. It gets heavy. Let's continue. Chapter 5. When Grief Demands a Sacrifice. It's strange how, when everything falls apart, people start looking for something or someone to blame. After the 1960 earthquake and tsunami devastated Chile, the shock wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Entire towns gone. Homes erased. Families shattered. And the ocean? The ocean didn't give anything back. No closure. Just silence. When you're standing in the ruins of everything you've ever known and no one can explain why it happened, your mind starts reaching. For reason. For justice. For control. And sometimes what it grabs onto is darker than the disaster itself. In one small community in southern Chile, that search for meaning led to something horrifying, a human sacrifice. And not just any sacrifice, a child. I hesitated when I first came across this part of the story. Honestly, I almost skipped it. It felt too heavy, too unreal. But the more I read, the more I realized this wasn't just an isolated tragedy. It was a consequence, an echo of everything that had already been lost. And it deserves to be told. The boy's name was José Luis Peñor. He was only 5 years old. José lived in a coastal town that had been devastated by the earthquake and flooding. His home was gone. His world was gone. His mother worked in another city, and his father wasn't around. So José was left in the care of his grandfather, a man who, like many others in the region, had grown up believing in Mapuche spiritual traditions. Now, in these traditions, the earth and sea aren't just elements, they're living beings. And when those forces rise up in anger, it's seen as a sign that balance has been broken. The only way to restore it, some believed, was to make an offering. At first, the community tried the usual things. They prayed. They held small ceremonies. Some sacrificed animals, chickens, goats, but none of it felt like enough. The ocean kept creeping in. Aftershocks kept rattling what little was left. People were still dying. It was like nature was demanding something more. And that's when a local shaman named Juana Nancucheo came forward with a horrifying suggestion. The gods weren't angry at their animals. They were angry at them, and what they needed was a pure soul, a child. There's no way to soften that. The shaman approached José's grandfather and explained the situation. She told him that sacrificing his grandson could save the entire village, that it would bring peace, that it was the only way. And somehow, whether out of fear or belief or utter emotional collapse, he agreed. The details of what happened next are blurry, almost surreal. Some say José was taken to the beach during the night. Others say it happened in the early hours of the morning as the sun was rising over a broken shore. But what they agree on is this: his arms and legs were removed. His body was placed upright in the sand like an offering, and then the tide came in and carried him away. There were horses sacrificed afterward. Some were eaten during the ceremony, but those were afterthoughts. José was the true sacrifice, the one they believed would finally stop the destruction, and for a time, maybe they thought it had worked. The village grew quiet. The ocean receded. People began rebuilding little by little, and José's name disappeared into whispers. But truth has a way of resurfacing. A few months later, 2 anthropologists arrived in the region studying how local communities were coping with the disaster. As they interviewed villagers, they started hearing rumors, hints, something about a ritual, a child, a body taken by the sea. Eventually, they pieced it together. They contacted the police, who launched an investigation, and what they found confirmed the worst. The sacrifice had really happened. The boy had really been chosen, and no one had stopped it. Shaman Juana José's grandfather and another unnamed man were arrested and put on trial. Under questioning, they confessed. They admitted to everything: the ceremony, the intention, the belief that it was necessary. But 2 years later, they took it all back. They recanted their confessions, claiming they were coerced, that none of it had happened, that it was just a misunderstanding. And surprisingly, the judge believed them. He ruled that they had acted under irresistible ancestral pressure, that they weren't in control of their actions, that fear and tradition had overridden reason. They were released from prison. And just like that, José's story was buried again. No justice, no grave, no acknowledgement in the national papers, just silence. And maybe that's what makes it so disturbing, because in a way, he became the final casualty of that earthquake. We often think of natural disasters as random amoral forces. The earth moves, the ocean swells. No one is to blame. But what we forget is that disasters don't just destroy homes, they fracture entire belief systems. They leave people desperate for meaning, for control. And in that desperation, terrible decisions can be made. This wasn't the 1500s, this was 1960. The same year people were dancing to Elvis Presley and watching black and white TV in their living rooms, a child was sacrificed on a beach in South America. Because people believed it was the only way to survive. And that's the part of the story we rarely tell. We talk about numbers, we talk about buildings, we talk about fault lines. But the deepest fault lines are the ones inside us, where fear meets belief and reason gives way to something primal. José's story is not just a tragedy, it's a warning. A reminder that even in the modern world, with all our science and progress, we're not as far from our ancient fears as we think. In the next chapter, we'll travel forward to 2011 to another earthquake and another tsunami. But this time, the fear wasn't about gods or spirits, it was about radiation. Because sometimes the scariest part of an earthquake isn't what it shakes loose in the ground, it's what it shakes loose in us. Let's keep going. Chapter 6: The Disaster We Didn't See Coming. We tend to think of technology as the great protector. Satellites, warning systems, nuclear containment. We convince ourselves that we've engineered our way out of danger, that if something catastrophic happens, there will be a button to press a protocol to follow a way to stop it before it becomes unmanageable. But on March 11th, 2011, the Earth reminded us that we're still incredibly vulnerable. That sometimes, despite all our machines and codes and contingency plans, there is no stopping what's already started. It began with a tremor. At 2:46 p.m., a magnitude 9.1 earthquake struck off the coast of Tohoku, a region in northeastern Japan. That's one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded in history. What's wild is that the epicenter wasn't even on land. It was deep beneath the ocean where tectonic plates had been pushing against each other in silence for centuries. And on that day, one plate finally slipped. In Tokyo, over 200 miles away, skyscrapers swayed like they were made of paper. People ran into the streets, confused, terrified, clinging to anything stable. The ground didn't just shake, it rolled. For 6 straight minutes. But once again, the earthquake wasn't the worst part. The worst part came after. Roughly 30 minutes after the quake, the sea began to pull back from the coastline. Locals knew what that meant. They'd seen it before. Tsunamis are tragically familiar in Japan. But this one wasn't familiar. It wasn't ordinary. It was something else entirely. What came crashing back wasn't just water, it was a wall. In some areas, the tsunami reached 130 feet high. That's taller than a 10-story building. Towns that had existed for centuries disappeared in minutes. Entire trains, cars, ships gone. The ocean swallowed everything and then threw it back in pieces. More than 18,000 people were killed. Thousands more were injured, missing, or displaced. Whole families were separated. Villages erased. Coastal communities became debris fields. And yet, that still wasn't the full extent of the disaster. Because along the coast stood the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Now, here's the thing. Nuclear plants are supposed to be among the most secure structures in the world. Engineers prepare for floods, fires, earthquakes, everything. When the quake hit, the safety systems kicked in like they were supposed to. The reactors automatically shut down. The problem was, they still needed to be cooled, constantly. And that cooling system depended on backup generators. So when the tsunami hit, stronger, taller, and more destructive than expected, it washed over the plant's seawalls, flooded the compound, and knocked out the generators. No generators meant no cooling system. And no cooling system meant the nuclear reactors inside started to overheat. Over the next several hours and days, 3 of the plant's reactors experienced core meltdowns. Hydrogen explosions tore through the buildings. Radiation began to leak, first into the air, then into the soil, then the ocean. What started as an earthquake had now triggered one of the worst nuclear disasters since Chernobyl. What really struck me when I learned about Fukushima was the people who stayed behind. As tens of thousands were ordered to evacuate, leaving homes, pets, memories, 50 engineers remained inside the plant. They worked in shifts wearing protective gear surrounded by radiation and rising pressure, doing everything they could to stabilize the reactors. They knew the risks. They knew they might die, but they stayed. The media started calling them the Fukushima 50. And to this day, they're remembered as heroes. Because without them, the plant could have exploded. The disaster could have gone global. The death toll could have been unspeakable. It's one of those moments that humbles you. Because here we are decades into the nuclear age, and yet a single wave of water could bring the entire system to its knees. Even today, Fukushima is not over. Entire towns remain empty, abandoned, like ghost cities. The radiation didn't just disappear. It sank into the ground, into the trees, into the water. There are zones where no one can live. where nature has taken back the streets, but humans still can't return. They might not be able to return for decades, maybe centuries. And the psychological toll that lingers too. People, displaced families, broken apart, children growing up with no memory of home, just stories of the day the ocean turned violent and the sky turned toxic. There's something especially terrifying about radiation. It's invisible, silent. You can't smell it, can't feel it. And by the time you realize it's there, it's already in you. After Fukushima, Japan reevaluated its entire energy policy. Public trust in nuclear power collapsed. Many plants were shut down. And a once proud industry was forced to reckon with a single truth: they weren't ready. And maybe that's the hardest part to accept, because this wasn't a story from centuries ago. It wasn't ancient history buried in myth. It was 2011. YouTube existed, Instagram existed. Hell, I remember what I was doing that day. We were connected digitally, globally, and yet none of that mattered when the ground moved and the sea followed. What this disaster showed us, just like Chile in 1960, just like China in 1556, is that nature doesn't care about borders or systems or technologies. It doesn't care how advanced we think we are. It just moves. And we're left to pick up the pieces. In the next chapter, we'll come home, back to California, back to a fault line that scientists have been warning us about for decades, the one they call the big one. It hasn't happened yet, but they say it will. And the only question left is when. Let's continue. Chapter 7, Waiting for the Big One. Growing up in California, there was always this quiet, lingering fear floating in the background. You'd hear about it in school, in the news, in those late-night conversations where someone says, "You know, they say we're overdue." And we all knew what it was. The big one. It wasn't a question of if. It was always when. That's the part that sticks with you. The idea that your entire life is being lived on a ticking time bomb, you just don't know how long the fuse is. The big one is what scientists call a future megathrust earthquake expected to hit California along the San Andreas Fault. It's projected to be at least a magnitude 7.8 or higher. And if you ask the experts, we're overdue by, well, decades. The San Andreas Fault is this massive crack in the earth where two tectonic plates meet: the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate. They're not friends. They're grinding against each other, constantly building pressure inch by inch, year by year. And eventually, that pressure has to go somewhere. The last truly catastrophic earthquake on the southern section of the San Andreas was in 1857. That was over 160 years ago. And according to scientists, that section usually breaks every 150 years or so. So, yeah, we're due. But what really makes the big one so terrifying isn't just the number. It's not just the shaking. It's the ripple effect, what happens after. We've seen it in Chile, we've seen it in Japan. The quake is just the trigger. In California, a major rupture on the San Andreas would cut through densely populated areas. We're talking Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Riverside. Some simulations predict that freeways would collapse, water lines would break, and millions of people would be left without power or communication for days, maybe longer. The scary part. It wouldn't just be a bad day. It would be the start of a long, hard recovery, one that could take years. And the truth is, we're not as ready as we think we are. Yes, California has some of the strictest seismic building codes in the world. Newer buildings are designed to move with the shaking instead of falling apart. There are early warning apps, emergency broadcast systems, earthquake insurance, you name it. But most of us, we're just hoping it doesn't happen on our watch. And I get that. I'm guilty of it too. I've got bottled water somewhere in the closet. I think there's a flashlight in the drawer. Maybe batteries, I'm not sure. And yet every time the ground shakes even just a little, there's that split second where I think, is this it? Is this the big one? There's something psychological about waiting for a disaster that you know is coming but can't do anything to stop. It creates this low-level anxiety that hums beneath your daily life. You drive past a bridge and wonder if it'll hold. You look at the bookshelf next to your bed and think, maybe I should bolt that down. But then you go on with your day, because what else can you do? You wait. And what's wild is that while we're waiting for the big one here, other places are already living through their version of it. Turkey, Indonesia, Haiti, Nepal. You realize earthquakes don't have a schedule. They don't care about calendars or warnings or how prepared you think you are. They just show up, uninvited, unapologetic. And maybe the most unsettling part, the idea that it might hit when we're most vulnerable, while we're sleeping, while we're driving, while we're at school with our kids. That lack of control, that unpredictability, is what makes the big one more than just a scientific prediction. It makes it personal. But here's what I try to hold on to: knowledge is power. Fear doesn't protect you, but preparation does. Knowing what to expect, where to go, what to avoid, that's how we take back some control in the face of the unknown. In the next chapter, I want to share some of that with you. Not in a boring checklist kind of way, but in a real human way. Because if the big one does come, and we know how to act, how to move, how to protect ourselves and the people around us, then we're not just waiting, we're surviving. Let's keep going. Chapter 8. When the ground moves. What you should really do. The thing about earthquakes is that they don't ask for permission. They just arrive. And if you're anything like me, you've probably spent a lot more time fearing them than actually preparing for them. For years, I told myself that if an earthquake hit, I'd know what to do. Get in a doorway, maybe stop, drop, and roll, crawl into the bathtub, I don't know. Most of what I thought I knew came from half-remembered childhood drills or disaster movies. But the truth is, when it actually happens, your brain doesn't have time to think. It just reacts, and that's where most of us get it wrong. So I started doing what I always do when something scares me. I researched the hell out of it. I watched videos, read expert interviews, listened to emergency specialists. I didn't want to live in fear. I wanted to understand. And what I found completely changed the way I think about surviving an earthquake. First of all, don't run. I know, it's the first instinct. Get up, get out. But that's actually one of the worst things you can do, especially if you're indoors. When the earth is shaking, the ground is unstable. So are the walls, the stairs, the things hanging above your head. And if you try to sprint through it, you're just adding chaos to chaos. Experts say running during an earthquake dramatically increases your risk of injury: twisted ankles, falling debris, shattered glass. It's not just about speed, it's about staying safe long enough to survive the initial shaking. So what should you do? It's surprisingly simple. Drop, cover, hold on. Yeah, it sounds like something from a kid's book, but it's the standard advice for a reason. If you're indoors, drop to the ground. Take cover under something sturdy, a table, a desk, even a chair, if that's all you've got. And then hold on until the shaking stops. And here's the part that surprised me most. It doesn't really matter how cheap or flimsy the table is. I watched a test where they recreated a roof collapse over a $20 IKEA table, and the person underneath was still protected. Unless it's made of glass, avoid glass tables at all costs. Most tables will shield you better than being out in the open. Now about that whole stand in a doorway thing. That used to be common advice, but it's outdated. Doorways used to be the strongest part of older homes. Today, not so much. Unless you live in a really old house, that doorway might collapse with everything else. If you're in bed when it hits, and honestly, a lot of earthquakes do happen at night, your best bet is to stay there. Cover your head with a pillow, turn your face away from windows, and ride it out. Trying to run in the dark, half asleep, while the floor is rolling beneath you. That's how injuries happen. If you're outside, stay away from buildings, trees, and power lines. Again, I know it sounds obvious, but in the moment we panic. We don't always realize how many things around us can fall. Streetlights, bricks, broken glass raining down. If you're in an open space, stay there. And if you're driving, slow down, pull over, and don't stop under a bridge or overpass. Stay in the car until the shaking ends. All of this is simple stuff, right? But knowing it before it happens, that's the difference between instinct and reaction, between panic and control. Something else I've started doing is looking around any room I walk into and asking, if the ground started shaking right now, where would I go? It's not about living in constant fear. It's about having a plan, even if it's silent and internal. Because if the big one or any quake hits while you're watching TV, making coffee, brushing your teeth, You're not going to have time to look up a how-to guide. You'll have only seconds. And in those seconds, what you do or don't do can decide everything. You don't need to be paranoid, but you do need to be ready. Because earthquakes aren't always about destruction. Sometimes they're about resilience, and the best kind of survival is the one you thought about before you needed it. We've talked about the science, the history, the heartbreak. But sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply know how to move when the world stops making sense. Let's keep going. Chapter 9. After the dust settles. Here's the thing no one really talks about when it comes to earthquakes. It's not just the buildings that crack. It's people. We spend so much time talking about numbers, magnitudes, death tolls, square miles of destruction that we forget about the invisible damage. The kind that sticks around long after the shaking stops. Because once the rubble is cleared, once the news cameras leave, once the hashtags fade, what's left behind is grief and fear and a deep, almost unspoken trauma that lives in the people who survived. I think about the parents who pulled their children out of collapsed homes, the elders who lost villages they'd lived in their entire lives, the children who never quite learned how to sleep soundly again. In Shanxi, they thought the gods were punishing them. In Chile, they gave a child to the sea, hoping it would stop the suffering. In Fukushima, people evacuated towns they would never return to, leaving their entire lives behind to protect their future. And here in California, we walk around every day on a fault line, pretending we're fine, but quietly wondering, what if today is the day it breaks? That's what earthquakes do. They force us to reckon with the illusion of control. We build our cities like they'll last forever. We fill our calendars like we know what's coming next. We make long-term plans, sign leases, book flights, save for retirement. But none of it matters when the ground decides to move. And that's terrifying. But it's also kind of profound. Because in those moments after the shaking when everything is still, we're reminded of something we don't like to admit, that we are all of us fragile. And yet, somehow still resilient. We rebuild. We mourn. We adapt. We tell stories like this one. We pass down knowledge. We improve building codes. We develop better technology. We share survival tips not just to prepare, but to stay connected. And maybe that's the part that sticks with me the most. Every earthquake we've talked about in this series, no matter where it happened or how devastating it was, revealed something about humanity. Not just how we suffer, but how we respond. Whether it was scientists staying behind at Fukushima, families rebuilding with bare hands in Chile, or people lighting candles and praying in ancient China, the instinct is always the same. We hold on. To each other, to meaning, to life. So when we talk about earthquakes, we're not just talking about fault lines and tectonic plates. We're talking about what it means to be human in a world that can shift under our feet at any moment. And honestly, I think that's a story worth telling. Let's finish this out together. Chapter 10. Stillness. If you've made it this far, I just want to take a moment and thank you. Because this wasn't an easy journey. We've walked through centuries of devastation. We've seen what happens when the ground betrays the people who live above it. We've stood beside families as they watched their homes disappear. We've listened to the silence that follows disaster and the questions that never get answered. And through it all, one thing has stayed with me. It's not the noise, it's the stillness. That eerie, heavy stillness that comes after the shaking stops. When the dust hangs in the air, when the birds haven't returned, when people walk the streets in shock, stepping over debris, unsure whether they should cry or just keep moving. There's something sacred about that kind of stillness. It's not peace, not exactly. It's more like a pause, a breath. The moment where the world holds itself together, even if just barely. And in that moment, you realize how little we truly need. Not the newest phone, not a 5-year plan, just people, safety, a glass of water, a roof that holds. Perspective comes fast when the walls fall down. But here's what's also true. There's beauty in how we rise again. Not in some dramatic Hollywood way, but in the quiet, daily kind. The neighbor who offers a blanket, the stranger who pulls someone from rubble, the teacher who shows up even when the school no longer stands. We rebuild in pieces, not in headlines. And even if it takes years, even if it takes generations, we carry the lessons forward. We build smarter, we listen harder. We prepare not just with kits and drills, but with empathy. Because if earthquakes have taught me anything, it's that we're more connected than we think. One shift in the earth and a village in Japan changes how a family in California thinks about safety. One ancient tragedy in China reminds us how far belief can go when fear takes hold. One boy's name, Jose Luis, echoes through time because someone decided his story mattered, and that's why I wanted to tell this story. Not to scare anyone, not to sensationalize suffering, but to remember, to reflect. To remind us that under all our progress, we're still just people trying to live on a moving planet. And maybe that's okay. Because when the earth quiets again, when the sky clears and the sirens fade, we begin again. We gather what's left, we look for one another. And we write new stories, not of fear, but of endurance. If there's one thing I hope you carry with you after this episode, it's this: you are not helpless. You are not alone. And even in the face of the most powerful forces on Earth, human resilience is louder than the quake itself. Thank you for being here with me through this journey. I'll see you in the next story. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of just how fragile but also how resilient we are, then I invite you to stay connected. Subscribe to True Crime Echoes, where we explore the darker, deeper corners of real-life tragedies, not for shock, but for truth. Because the echoes of the past still live with us today, and the more we listen, the more we understand. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and stay grounded.